Okay, great. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's 2 o'clock. I think a lot of people are already on, which is great. We can be timely today. Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Wooten. I'm the president of the Atlanta Press Club. Thank you for joining us today for our online Newsmaker event, a conversation with Stacey Abrams about voting in Georgia 2020. During this unprecedented time, online events such as these allow us to engage experts and top journalists in discussions about the impacts of COVID-19 upon the health and livelihoods of journalists and people from all walks of life. Challenging times require clarity of mission and earnest consideration of what can be improved. This is in keeping with our mission to serve the evolving professional, educational, and social needs of our media community while we foster journalistic excellence and advance the public's understanding of a free press. Thank you for supporting the work of the Atlanta Press Club by being with us here today. If you want to learn more about what we do at the Press Club, see our upcoming events, or to make a donation, visit our website at atlantapressclub.org. Also today, we would like to extend a special welcome and thank you to our title sponsor, Wellstar Healthcare System. Wellstar is the sponsor of the entire Newsmaker series, and we are very grateful for their support. So, before I introduce everybody, I think everybody who's on already knows who we have here, our moderator and our guest speaker. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to tell everyone that we will be accepting questions through the question and answer Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. So you just click on the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then you can send a question if you have one for our speakers. And we have a staff member who will be funneling those questions to our moderator. And today, thank you so much. Ricky Bevington of Georgia Public Broadcasting is here to lead our discussion. As senior anchor and correspondent, Ricky is an award-winning journalist who serves as a local host for NPR's nationally syndicated All Things Considered. Please welcome Ricky, who will introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you so much, Christy. Can everybody hear me okay?
Sound good.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks to everyone who's here on a Monday afternoon. It is the first day of early voting in Georgia, so this is a very topical conversation. The Georgia primary election is June 9th. Runoff elections are in July, and of course, the general election is in November. There is so much for us to be talking about on the topic of voting. We're also in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. We are so pleased to have Stacey Abrams with us today to discuss the state of voting in 2020, her work to fight voter suppression, and also upcoming projects. Abrams is a New York Times bestselling author, entrepreneur, nonprofit CEO, and political leader. She served 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as Democratic leader. In 2008, Abrams became the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, winning more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. Abrams was the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. And she was the first Black woman and the first Georgian to deliver a response to the State of the Union. 2 years ago, Abrams launched Fair Fight to ensure every American has a voice in our election system through programs such as Fair Fight 2020, an initiative to fund and train voter protection teams in 20 battleground states. Stacey Abrams, welcome to the Atlanta Press Club.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Well, I want to begin by saying thank you not only to Ricky, but to Christy for such a generous welcome. I want to extend my deepest hope that everyone is safe, that your families are safe and healthy. But we have an issue. In the United States and in Georgia in particular, we face the specter of voter suppression. This is something that we saw play out in graphic technicolor in 2018, when thousands of Georgians were denied the right to vote, whether they had been unlawfully and erroneously purged, whether they had to wait in long lines because of under-resourced precincts, the fact that a number of Georgians had no polling places to get to because 214 of them had shut down, leading to between 50 and 80,000 people being denied the right to vote, and the issues of exact match and signature mismatching, causing people either not to make it onto the rolls or to have their absentee ballots rejected, as well as a plethora of provisional ballots that were never counted. Georgia faced voter suppression in 2018. And that was singular in Georgia, but not solely in Georgia. Across our country, voter suppression has been alive and well and active in the last 20 years. We have seen it play out in three ways. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you get access to a ballot? And does that ballot get counted? Across the country, we have 50 different states with different laws that determine how those three processes are met. But the reality is that if there's any impediment to allowing someone to register and stay on the rolls when they are legally eligible, allowing someone to cast a ballot and allowing that ballot to be counted when that does not happen because of the administration or misadministration of our elections, then voter suppression is real. And I want to put to rest right now the conversation that keeps bubbling up, which is one that voter fraud is at play as well. Even if you look at the Heritage Foundation's amalgamation of the number of voter fraud claims in the country, you will find that it is de minimis when compared to the number of ballots actually cast. But we do know that hundreds of thousands of Georgians and that around the country, millions of Americans face the specter of not being allowed to vote, though it is their constitutional right. When I did not become governor of Georgia in 2018, and there's some who think I'm confused, I'm not. When I did not get that job, my responsibility was to think about the work I would have done had I become governor. I launched 3 organizations. The Southern Economic Advancement Project focuses on the policies that could help make the South stronger, particularly looking at economic security. And in this moment of COVID-19, thinking about the policies and prescriptions that could have made us more resilient to the attack of COVID-19. I created Fair Count, which looks at the issue of the census, because Georgia is one of the states that has a high undercount, particularly because we are comprised of the communities of color, the rural communities, the renters, and the young children and the immigrants who usually make up the hardest to count populations. The reality is that the undercount Georgia experienced in 2010 is part of the reason we are under-resourced in 2020 and fighting back against COVID-19. And unfortunately, we are not on track to do better. Right now, the national response rate in the census is 59%. Georgia is hovering around 55 to 57%. We need to meet the moment, and we need to be counted if we want the resources, both the economic and the political power that is ascribed and prescribed by the census. But what I'm best known for is Fair Fight. This is an organization that was designed to respond to the issue of voting, because the power of our democracy lies in our ability to cast a ballot and pick our leaders. We are a representative democracy where each of us has a say in who should lead us, who should guide the count of our census, who should determine the policies that help us respond to a crisis, and who sets the course of the next generation. In Georgia and around the country, we are facing an unprecedented challenge to our right to vote. We have reached a pinnacle where we have actually, for the first time, we have constitutional amendments that guarantee almost every group of people who've been left out of the process, they have access. But with the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, we have seen a weakening of access to democracy in America, and no place shows it more sharply than Georgia. But we also know that there is a fix, that the solution to the brokenness of our democracy is not giving one party or the other more power, but giving the power back to the people to be able to cast their ballots. And that's the fundamental mission of Fair Fight. The work we're doing now, both in Georgia and around the country, is simply focused on ensuring that there is a fair fight. There's no guarantee of outcome. Elections aren't partisan. The selections we make are, but the elections themselves, the process should not be subject to partisanship. But let's go back to that frame of voter suppression. Being able to register and stay on the rolls is a critical need in America. And Georgia actually has some of the better laws. We know that we have online voter registration, which is important, but it is basically inaccessible if you live in the number of counties that we have in Georgia, where you have very limited access to broadband. And there tends to be a concomitant effect of those who have lack of access to the internet and those who are distanced from participation in our democracy. We have to solve for that problem, and we have to ensure that absolutely we have access in every place to register to vote. That has been done by third-party organizations, but in the time of COVID-19, third-party registration is lessened, if not at a standstill. But that should not be the permanent case. That is one of the reasons that the HEROES Act the COVID-19 response bill that was introduced in the House and passed last week is asking the federal government to mandate not only online registration, but same-day registration. People who have to correct the record, who need to be able to access a ballot, should be able to do so even if they don't have the ability to go to a polling place or go to a county clerk's office to get that information, and particularly if they are denied the ability to do so online. But the second issue is, can you stay on the rolls? In December 2019, the state of Georgia undertook a massive purge of our voters, more than 300,000. Through fair fight action, we were able to push back and file a lawsuit, an injunction, that led to 26,000 people being put back on the rolls, between 22 and 26,000. That restoration of voters back to the rolls is emblematic of the flaw embedded in the notion of purging voters. 22,000 mistakes should not be warranted in any process, let alone the process of accessing democracy. But in addition, we know of another 100,000 people who, under a law passed by the state of Georgia in 2019, should have been permitted to stay on the rolls because they should have been pushed into the category of people who were allowed not to vote for a second number of years. The reality is, in the United States, and particularly in Georgia, the failure to use your right to vote means you lose your right to vote. And that should not be. That's the only constitutional right you lose for simply not using it. Even though I know how to shoot and know how to hunt, I don't lose my Second Amendment right because I haven't gone hunting in the last few months or the last few years. And despite the fact that I may skip church every few Sundays, that does not cost me my freedom of religion. We should not lose the right to vote. And yet Georgia is one of 9 states that by law permit the loss of your right to vote, and one of 44 states that by practice actually remove access to the right to vote. And in a time of COVID-19, this is a danger because we do not provide adequate remedy for people to get back on the rolls if they do not have access either to the fact that they've been pulled from the list, or the fact that they have seen mistakes in the database about their behavior. Number 2, we have to look at the issue of vote by mail. We know that the HEROES package is actually a gold standard for how voting should happen in 2020. We watched in horror as those in Wisconsin were forced into the streets to stand shoulder to shoulder simply to participate in an election. Dozens of Wisconsinites contracted COVID-19 because of the perfidy and the bad behavior of the state legislature, of the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, and the US Supreme Court that said they had to risk their lives to cast a ballot. That should not happen in the United States. By contrast, we know that in South Korea, President Moon was able to oversee the single largest election held in that nation since the 1990s, because they understood that a pandemic should not diminish your democratic rights. But in the United States, we are fighting to ensure that vote by mail is accessible. But here's why it matters. We know that we have to have safe and accessible elections in November because despite any popular mythology, the election cannot move. It is going to happen on November 3rd because that's what the Constitution and the Congress requires. If that is the goal, then we have to be taking every step possible to ensure access. That means that we need to first and foremost invest in states, including the state of Georgia, to ensure that vote by mail can be appropriately scaled. That means making sure that $3.6 billion is allocated across the country to the states. And Georgia needs those resources too. When we hear about the diminution in tax revenue coming into our state, that includes the monies that pay for our elections. And that is why we need the partnership of the federal government to ensure that we have access to those resources. Georgia actually does a pretty good job of vote by mail. We have had vote by mail with no excuses since 2005. But at the same time, we have seen the Secretary of State's office try to deliberately impede the use of that right by charging people with questions of fraud and dampening the use of that mechanism. For example, in Quitman in 2010, we know that 12 people were arrested and charged with 120 felonies simply for following the rules and accessing vote by mail. That has created a dampening effect in South Georgia that continues to this day. We should not penalize our Americans. We should not penalize our Georgia citizens for simply using the right that is granted to them by citizenship. And in 2020, we were very proud to see that Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger was willing to use the power in his office to expand access to the right to vote by sending out 6.9 million absentee ballot applications. But sadly, despite that bipartisan effort to ensure access for every Georgian who is eligible to vote, He followed it up by creating a faux voter fraud commission. Much like the commission that was created in 2017 by Donald Trump, it has no purpose because voter fraud is not a challenge in the state of Georgia. It is not an issue nationally, but we know that intimidation is. And in fact, we know that the Republican National Committee has been working to put together a voter fraud language and narrative to try to intimidate voters from using the rights that they have. Georgia is better than this, and we have the resources to be better than this. We need to meet the gold standard of vote by mail, meaning that the ballots are postage paid for return. I'm sorry, that the applications are postage paid for return, that they are sent to every eligible voter and not simply every active voter, because active voters exclude newly registered voters and those who may have been moved to inactive status but are still eligible to vote. We need to make certain that the ballot itself can be returned postage paid. Those are things that the state may not be able to afford on its own, which is why it's so critical that the HEROES Act be enacted and those dollars come to our states. And whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, we should be demanding that the federal government do its job and invest in the conduct of our elections. But our second responsibility when it comes to vote by mail is it's the way we provide safety and security to our fellow Georgians. We know that if people vote by mail, we can move between 50 to 70% of voters out of line, meaning those who have to vote in person have the ability to do so. Georgia, again, has a gold standard of 3 weeks of early voting, but that gold standard only matters if we actually have locations for people to reach and if we do not diminish the number of hours when people can vote by mail, can vote in person. But then on election day, we have to recognize that between early voting and election day, there are certain populations that must vote in person. Those are the disabled, those with language barriers, those who are homeless or have been displaced by COVID-19, those who attempt to vote by absentee but are not able to do so. They need to be able to cure their ballots, either a signature mismatch issue or some database issue. And that means they're going to have to be able to go in person. And our responsibility is to make sure the lines are lessened so that those who need to show up can, and those who do not need to be there in person have already cast their ballots. Fundamentally, the right to vote in Georgia is the right to set the direction of our future. We face very tumultuous times, very turbulent times, and very tough decisions. And in every election, we are making a choice about the kind of state we wish to be. Georgia has the seeds of greatness. We have the capacity to do more, but we have to have the willingness to hold our leadership accountable and to invest in every voter. That is fundamentally the premise of Fair Fight. We want to make sure that not only do we have the right to vote, but that that right to vote is real. Because if we do that here in Georgia, we can be a symbol across the country of what can be accomplished, and we can have a fair fight in 2020 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey Abrams, for your comments. I'd like to invite everybody who is on with us today to submit a question for Ms. Abrams via the chat function of your Zoom. This will go to the moderators of this Zoom, and I will effectively read your question off of the chat function. This will hopefully keep things moving smoothly. I will just open up while people get their thoughts together and start typing into your chat function. I will start with a question. What has been the most surprising thing to you about the way that the pandemic has affected voting in Georgia already?
I think it's been the dramatic increase in interest in vote by mail. Again, I want to give credit to the joint decision by the Secretary of State and the Democratic Party to support sending out 6.9 million applications. We know that at this moment, at least 1.4 million absentee ballot requests have been returned. That's a fantastic number and a high percentage. We do know, though, that there's been confusion because of changes in the law, because of the way the mailers have been submitted and returned. And we do know that Georgia has a signature mismatch law. And so I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised, by our willingness to participate in vote by mail at the scale that we need to respond. But I've been disappointed by the Secretary of State's parallel action of creating this voter intimidation operation where he engaged law enforcement and essentially threatened anyone who made a mistake with absentee balloting that they would be investigated for fraud. Fraud is not a challenge in Georgia. Democrats and Republicans both agree. And to mar the specter of what looks to be like good democracy happening in Georgia with this threat, I think undermines the credibility of our operations, but we still have time to correct it by saying that we believe and that we trust Georgia citizens to do the right thing to protect themselves and their families and their communities.
Voting not during a pandemic is a huge logistical challenge. Obviously, right now, elections officials are getting flooded with mail-in ballots. And just this morning, actually, the state elections board in Georgia ruled unanimously that absentee ballots can be opened 8 days prior to election day, which is June 9th. They can't be scanned, they can't be counted until after the polls close, but they can be opened to help facilitate moving things along. Do you agree with this decision?
I am concerned because we have not always had the best actions in the state of Georgia when it comes to elections, but I understand the issue. And my hope is that there will be an observational posture so that we can ensure that every opened ballot is treated appropriately. We know that Georgia has done good things by adding drop boxes. That needs to be in every single county. We know that Georgia is trying to make accommodations. And so I understand the logistical imperative, but I will reserve judgment because I want to make certain that we don't have any concerns of shenanigans and chicanery around the use of our ballots and the counting thereof.
Thank you. I'm going to go to some questions now from Stephen Fowler from Georgia Public Broadcasting. What are your thoughts on a bill filed this year that would require counties to either hire more staff, add more voting machines, or split up precincts where there are many registered voters and continuously long lines?
I think that those are important solutions to the challenge. In 2018, Georgia had the single longest lines in the country for African American voters. That is not a distinction we should enjoy. This is not a symbol of enthusiasm about elections. It's a direct result of underinvestment in those communities. And so, yes, we should make certain that there is equity in voting. Now, I will say that sometimes the solution is to have more machines. Sometimes the solution is to have more staff. Sometimes the solution is to train the staff differently because of the composition of voters who will be going to certain precincts. And what I think this bill attempts to do is to meet the need of equity, that every eligible Georgian has the right to vote and that that right to vote is made real by being able to go through the process in a timely fashion. Because 4 hours in a line in a state like Georgia where we do not pay, you cannot be guaranteed pay for your time off. That doesn't take into account how long it took you to get there and whether you're going to be able to go back to work if you've missed a shift. But that also undermines the ability of every Georgian to make timely decisions for their family. And so, yes, I think that it's an important bill and something we should continue to evaluate and pursue.
Is there a state or even a nation elsewhere in the world that you think is doing voting right that we should be modeling our Georgia's elections after? Or is it everybody kind of a different system and you want to cobble it all together? Is there one model that you look toward?
I mean, I think in the midst of a pandemic, we have to be thoughtful about what's possible and what's scalable. I think what happened in South Korea made a lot of sense. It was an extraordinarily safe and clean election where they provided PPE not only to every person manning the polls, but to every person voting. They had a system that was designed to ensure that no one risked their lives. But we also have to add into it the fact that we need absentee balloting in the state of Georgia. It's something we know how to do. It's something that works when we scale it appropriately and when we provide education and information about it. And so I think Georgia's in a good place, but there are places where we have to fix it. But there's a fundamental challenge in America, which is that we're one of the only industrialized, democratized nations that sets as a point of entry a barrier called registration by the voter. In almost every other nation, voter registration is automatic. It is a hobbling effect on our ability to participate because voter registration puts the onus on community members who may or may not have equal access to information or to opportunity. People look at the work that's been done for motor voter, but for people who don't drive and who never have cause to go into a DMV, that is a diminution of their ability to vote. And it doesn't take into account the very different experiences that people have. And so I think as the point of entry, we need to model every other democratized nation with which we compete, and we should make voter registration absolutely automatic and allow for same-day registration, which allows us to account for any changes in people's addresses and locality.
We have a question from Jocelyn Dorsey who asked, although Georgia sent out absentee ballot applications, as you said, 6.9 million registered voters received these. Dorsey says there's no follow-up to let registered voters know whether that application has been received or even processed. How could that be corrected in the future?
And I think, I don't want to say it's a good problem to have, but it is a better problem than what we would have faced, which is likely going to be either seeing a dramatic drop in the number of people trying to vote or people crowding into polling places as we saw in Wisconsin because of the importance of this election. The most important next step is to be able to have the resources to scale the process. We have a number of under-resourced county clerks who are trying to do this work without the resources they need. If you look at Fulton County, DeKalb County, Gwinnett County, those are hundreds of thousands of applications being processed, but without a scaling up of the number of staff who were supposed to get that work done. And I think that's one of the reasons we see the State Elections Board taking the position it takes. But the reason we need the resources from the federal government is because that's why we have a federal government, to invest in states to help them scale up in times of crisis. This is a crisis. There was no way to anticipate the necessity of this number of people voting by mail. States that do this regularly have had a decade or more of experience. Georgia has not, and so we need the resources to scale it up. But we also need folks to know that if you have questions about your ballot, please you can Google the Georgia My Voter page and it will tell you the status of your ballot. And you can go to fairfightaction.com and get information from our vote by mail site that can help you figure out where you need to go. But the reality is, for most Georgians, the issue is going to be not that you should panic, but that it's going to be slow because the resources just weren't there for what we have to do in this election cycle.
Question from Candace Presley. Early voting begins today. Some voters are appearing in person because they've not received their mail-in ballots yet. Should these voters appear in person or wait for their ballot to arrive? And just as a reminder, there's 3 weeks of early voting in the state of Georgia that begins today.
Again, Georgia actually does a number of the things that on the national level, the HEROES Act would require. And that is permitting people to vote early, making sure they have 3 weeks to do so, and having the ability to do so through vote centers in your counties. I don't want to discourage anyone from voting in person, but I don't want people to vote in person because they're afraid they won't get their absentee ballot yet. I would first start by checking to see the status of your absentee ballot request. If you see that it hasn't been processed or hasn't been received, you can follow the process to get that updated. But the reason we want in-person early voting is that there are going to be people who need to do so in person. And that could be a database challenge, because in Georgia, we have seen a number of issues with the database being maintained appropriately, people's addresses being accurate, the status of their voting being accurate. And so it may make sense to go in, but what I would advise everyone to do is to first make sure that you've given enough time for your application to be processed and for your ballot to be delivered.
Just in the 30 minutes that we've been chatting, you've actually had a lot of positive things to say about how Georgia runs its elections.
Yeah, Georgia has the infrastructure necessary. What we've seen, unfortunately, is the manipulation of some of our more questionable moments, and we've seen the actions taken to limit who has access to vote. So yes, we have the right infrastructure for vote by mail. We are a state that has the gold standard for in-person early voting, but we're also a state that aggressively purges voters. We're a state that has a poor track record of maintaining our databases. We are a state that has made it difficult for third parties to register voters, especially voters of color, without being subject to investigation by the Secretary of State's office. We're a state that has under-resourced and under-trained the county officials responsible for executing our elections. And unfortunately, under the previous Secretary of State, the authority to do things, basically the Secretary of State took credit for things that were done well and cast blame for things that were done poorly. And the reality is the election superintendent in the state of Georgia is the Secretary of State. We know that under-resourcing led to the longest lines in America for African Americans for voting. We know that we had purging that pushed people off the rolls who should not have been removed. We had 214 precincts shut down, and under the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's own independent analysis, that caused between 50 and 80,000 people to lose access to the right to vote. We had a disproportionate number of people who had their absentee ballots rejected due to signature mismatch laws. It was so egregious that the state of Georgia entered into a consent decree this year to correct how they process it. So yes, there are good things about our system, because I don't want people to think that everything is broken, but the things that are broken are so fractured that eligible Americans and eligible Americans and eligible Georgians have been denied the right to vote, and that should not happen in a democracy, especially in a time of pandemic where we have to decide who is going to lead us to recovery.
You've mentioned the signature match law a couple of times. What would be the ideal signature match system for you?
There should be no signature match. We know that the forensic scientists who have examined signature match laws have called it junk science, that the average person, the average poll worker, has no ability to evaluate the correctness of signatures as a comparative. I just cast for everyone. Think about when you signed your driver's license. You signed it with a stylus, usually sitting in a cramped office at the DMV when you were waiting for them to take your picture with that little tiny camera. That signature is not the same as the signature you're going to use when you're sitting at your table with a pen, laying on a flat table, signing the back of your absentee ballot. But under Georgia law, they can try to match those two signatures despite different implements, different papers, and the time of day, the age. We know as we get older, our signatures change. We know that if you were sick on the day you signed one and well on the next day, it differs. It is junk science to say that this is a way to prove the valid ID and identity of the person who's returning that absentee ballot. And that's why we fought so hard to make certain there are better standards. But the best standard is that you don't have these laws, but the next step is to at least make certain that there's the ability to cure any misunderstanding and any mismatch in the evaluation of your signature.
We have a question from Amy Schiff, who says, do you have an opinion about mandatory voting?
I do not actually share the notion that people should be compelled to vote. The nature of democracy is that you get to choose. You can choose between the candidates on the ballot, or you can decide that you don't want to participate or that it's none of the above. But the choice should belong to the voter. And the challenge we have in America is that the choice doesn't belong to the voter. Too often voters have the choice made for them because of the hobbling, the hindrance, and the obstacles that are put in their way in order to get from the thought of participation to actually having that ballot counted.
I'm going to just pause for a second to remind anyone who's joining us that you are welcome to submit a question via the chat function. If you could keep it brief, that would be great, because I'm literally reading these off the screen. I appreciate it. We have a lot of really local in the weeds questions about Georgia elections processes, but we're open to all questions right now. I'm going to scroll back up to Andrew Staunton, who asks, where are the other states experiencing similar challenges, and are actions there having more success?
So one of the goals of Fair Fight action began here in Georgia with a focus on Georgia, which led to our lawsuit against the state of Georgia for its systems and for the flaws in the system that invalidate the access to the right to vote that every eligible Georgian should enjoy. But we created Fair Fight 2020 because we understood that in states across the country, the challenges of voter suppression are real. And again, I always return to that framework. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and can that ballot be counted? The challenge in America is that it looks different in every single state. The 18 states where we're operating this year are states that have faced the challenges of voter suppression in very real and critical ways. And they're the states that are going to be the tipping point in deciding who wins the White House, who wins the Senate, but also who wins down ballot races like governors and state legislative chambers. So for example, in Wisconsin has a number of these challenges. They have a signature mismatch law. They have a law that requires that you have to have a witness to sign your absentee ballot. But in the midst of quarantine, there were 600,000 Wisconsinites who lived alone who were possibly unable to get a signature. There are 10 states that either require a signature or a notary. And I dare most Americans to find a notary right now who can notarize your ballot. Those are challenges that exist across the country. We have voter ID laws that are absolutely restrictive. And let's be clear, there is almost no state that doesn't require some form of ID. When there is a complaint in voter suppression about voter ID, it is not that ID is required, it's how restrictive that ID is. And the best examples are in Wisconsin, for example, again, in the state of Wisconsin, when they changed their voter ID laws, they require an original birth certificate. There was a woman who was 100 years old who'd voted in Wisconsin for decades. But because they changed the rules, when she went to get her updated license that would permit her to cast a ballot, she was denied the right to vote because she was born during segregation in Missouri, was not allowed to be born in a hospital. And even though they could find records of her in the census from the 1930s and her proof of actually being a Wisconsin resident and a Wisconsin taxpayer, she was denied the right to vote in 2016. We know down in Texas that you can vote with a gun license, but not with a student ID. We know that in Florida, that we have challenges with signature mismatches and with absentee ballots actually being sent to voters. And so if you look at the 18 states where we're operating, it's because in each of those states, there's some form of suppression. But what's happening this year that we haven't seen in active times is that we are actually tackling these issues long before November. One of the things I'm most excited about is that good groups that have been focusing on how do we expand access to our democracy to eligible citizens, that we've been able to file lawsuits, we've been able to train and staff and advocate in those states. Fair Fight 2020 is in 18 states. We have 43 employees that are working inside those states, making sure that access to the right to vote is real. We're in Wisconsin, we're in Virginia, we're in Michigan, we're in Georgia, and we're around the country because we want to make sure the right to vote is real in every state.
I'm not going to ask you to predict voter turnout in every state, but I will ask you to talk about your thoughts on what you're anticipating for voter turnout in November in Georgia and how that will impact what's on the ballot in Georgia.
I think it's going to depend on what the access looks like. I am proud that Fair Fight is part of a consortium of groups that have launched a voter empowerment task force, because we know that one of the stated goals of the Republican National Committee is to limit who votes in 2020. We have seen that they plan to invest millions of dollars to raise an army of 50,000 to engage in poll observation. We know that when they did this before, the multiple times they were cited for it, it was so egregious that they were under a 40-year consent decree declaring that they should not be permitted to undertake this type of voter fraud intimidation. Unfortunately, that was lifted. And so for 2020, it's the first presidential election where the Republican National Committee can publicly and aggressively coordinate with public and private organizations to intimidate voters under the specter and the lie of voter fraud. And so my goal is to not say that I know what turnout will look like in Georgia or elsewhere, but to ensure that we remove as many barriers as possible. I'm very enthusiastic about the number of voters who've already asked for absentee ballots. That's a dramatic increase in our state, but I want to see how our primaries operate. But we know that we have a lot of work to do because voters are not only scared of voting because they're afraid for their lives, they're scared of voting because they don't know it will work. And the work that we've been trying to do for the last 18 months, last 2 years, is to remind Georgians that the right to vote is their power, and it is absolutely something that they should be able to take advantage of. And we're going to do our work to remove any barriers to the casting of those ballots.
Everybody's phone's off. Great. Okay. I'm just clicking through questions here, just reminding everybody that you may submit a question in the chat function. Here's a question. Social distancing is likely to cause long lines at the polls for those who do choose to vote in person. Candace Presley said today already people are showing up to vote in person early. What potential problems do you see arising from people voting in person?
The challenge for voting in person is exacerbated if we don't get as many people out of line as possible. And so in the midst of pandemic, given our systems, the only true protection is to remove as many people as possible from the lines so that those who do show up can safely meet the CDC guidelines of spacing, of protective gear, and that they have the ability to do so in a timely fashion. I believe we can meet that challenge. One of the reasons we set up Fair Fight 2020 in the 20 states early is that we wanted to use primaries as a way to test what is going to likely happen in November. And what we will learn from this experience is what is likely going to occur, because let's be clear, Georgia and the United States will experience a second wave, barring some miracle that no epidemiologist has predicted. And if we presume that there will be a second wave of COVID-19 that will crash into the November elections, our best opportunity is the HEROES Act, which will invest in every state, allow states like Georgia to scale up, because as we've heard from what the elections board said, they're going to have to change their behavior because they do not have adequate staff and adequate resources to process just the number of absentee ballots that they're going to get in this election. So we have to know that we make, number one, absentee ballot has to be, vote by mail has to be seen as the safest and most accessible way to vote, which is why being postage paid, being pre-sent, and making certain that every voter, not just active voters, but every eligible voter receives those applications and those ballots is a critical step to thinning the lines. Because once you've gotten between 50 to 70% of those people out of line and you spread it out over 3 weeks, you can have safe in-person voting. They were able to do safe in-person voting in South Korea. The challenge is that we have to have both mechanisms in place if we want elections to be safe, secure, and well-attended.
We have a couple of questions that are about politics. I'm going to stay on the stated theme of this talk, which is elections in Georgia, for a little while longer. I promise I'll get to a couple of political questions. We actually have 2 questions about curbside voting. I don't know what curbside voting is, and what's your opinion of it? Is it something you can explain to us?
So in some states, they will actually bring out essentially the tablet, the screen. You get to complete your vote in that way. And then in states that do paper ballots, you can fill it out and you seal it and you put it in. So curbside voting allows you to do it without having to go inside. Some actually set up stations that essentially look like you're ordering from fast food. You fill out your ballot, you finish it up, and then you move on. And so it differs from state to state, but it is a legitimate way to allow people to vote. Our mission is to limit those people who have to come in contact with one another, because the goal is to increase participation when people aren't afraid. And so whether it's curbside voting or drop boxes or absentee ballots, the goal is to diminish the number of people who could possibly either contract the disease or spread the disease. And by doing so, by giving as many options as possible, we increase the likelihood of participation, which should be the goal of every Georgian and every American, to hear from the voices of the people no matter where they live.
We have a question from Grant Kierpa, who says, do you believe that the new Dominion voting system that Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger purchased will help with some of the issues that you've mentioned today? And for a primer, Georgia's new election system, which was rolled out, I guess in March officially, is touchscreen that prints a ballot. You approve the ballot as you think you punched it into the screen, and then it gets scanned to cast the vote. In a nutshell, that's the new system.
I am skeptical but hopeful. The challenge is that the new systems add an additional step, and every additional step added complicates voting. It is an important protection for people to be able to see their vote. It is a deep distress to me that the reader is going to read the code and not read the words. And so there's no way to validate and to match the code that is read by the scanner, as opposed to being able to actually read the words and people to know that what they've filled out is what's going to be processed. And so there's still legitimate suspicion of the system and its accuracy, but it's better than what we had. But my challenge is that we shouldn't settle for just better than what we had. We should be aiming for the gold standard and what is best. And I'm willing to see what happens now because it's what we've got. And so our mission should be to, again, limit the number of people who have to risk the possibility of this not being effective by getting as many people as possible to vote by mail.
We have a question from Matthew Divinieri, who says, what is your view on making Election Day a national holiday?
I think making it a holiday is a good idea, but we have to recognize that in the United States, the fact that something is a holiday does not mean everyone gets to celebrate it or take advantage of it. For example, those voters who are disabled, they will require someone to assist them. That means that we're going to have to take it into account, the fact that there are going to be a number of people who can't participate on the national holiday, but every step towards making it easier to vote is a good thing, but we shouldn't see one idea in one moment as a panacea, because we have a complicated nation where we know that there are going to be some workers who aren't covered, some workers who are necessary, and some folks who simply can't take advantage. And so we shouldn't reduce our solutions to a single thing, but having a national holiday is a good idea.
We have a question from the Atlanta Press Club. Young voters turning 18 and didn't get to graduate because of the pandemic. How do we motivate them? Did Stacey see Obama's speech to the 2020 graduates?
I did see the speech, and I thought it was extraordinary, which is problematic because I'm going to do one for our Fair Fight U graduates. Part of what we've done with Fair Fight is we created Fair Fight U, which is a group of students across 14 campuses in Georgia, and actually we have a couple of satellites nationwide. And I'm going to be participating in a virtual commencement for them. One that's going to go out not only to our college graduates, but our high school graduates, because we have a number of high school students who've been actively involved in trying to make sure the right to vote is real for every Georgian. But I think most of all, we have to settle their minds that the right to vote should not be jeopardized simply because of emergency. That the needs that they have, especially in this moment of fear and trepidation, they should believe that more is possible, that better is possible. And in every conversation we have, in every speech we give, and particularly in the act of engaging these new voices in our democracy, they should not face unnecessary hurdles to participation. We know a lot of them don't have driver's licenses. A lot of them are not going to, this is going to be the first time they've participated, and we want to make it as easy and as seamless as possible so that they become not just habitual voters, but they become voters as a matter of course. When that happens, we have a stronger democracy, and they can start to see the reality of what they dream of come to fruition.
Question from Maria Topolova. As a progressive Democrat yourself, what would you say to young Bernie Sanders supporters who have now seen strong opposition to democratic socialism in 2 consecutive presidential campaigns?
I would say first that the labels we ascribe to what we want matter, but what matters even more is the reality. For example, I'm a strong supporter of Vice President Biden because of his stated belief and his early adoption of environmental protections and climate action. In fact, he introduced legislation in 1986 to start addressing this issue. I support his commitment to reproductive choice, his commitment to a number of the policies and plans that were proposed both by Bernie Sanders and by Elizabeth Warren. I'm deeply enthusiastic about his willingness to think broadly about what needs to happen next. And so what I would say is that we should look at not just the labels of those we would have wanted and the labels ascribed to the policies, but we should look at the policies themselves and realize that even if we don't get the person we want, that does not, it doesn't abdicate us from the responsibility of needing to press for what we desire. And that's only accomplished through voting. Voting is how we select leaders and how we hold them accountable. And I would tell young voters, Bernie voters or otherwise, that if we want better, we have to demand it, and we demand it first through election.
Have you had conversations with Joe Biden about your issues regarding your work regarding voter suppression?
I have.
Has he made it
really in public a couple of days ago?
Tell me what you and Biden agree on vis-a-vis voting.
We agree, one, that voter suppression is real. We agree, number two, that we have a responsibility to aggressively expand access to the right to vote to every eligible American. And we agree that this can't simply be about a single election. It's about how we actually structure our democracy for today and for the future. It's why I focus not simply on voter suppression as an act that happens through elections. I also focus on the census, because let's be clear, the census in the country allocates $1.5 trillion per year to the states, but it also allocates the number of congressional leaders we get. In 2010, Georgia, because of our population, we picked up an additional congressperson. But it's also how we draw the lines for political voice in our state, from the state legislature all the way down to school board. And we know that matters. As our demographics change, not just racial, but economic and the needs and social, we need to have representation that actually sees and believes in every single Georgian. And so what the Vice President and I have discussed, and we share this belief, is that we have to make certain that our census is accurate, that we have accessible elections, that the HEROES Act reflect the needs of America. Now, he isn't, I don't want to speak for him on the HEROES Act, but we have agreed, and as I espoused in our joint conversation, we must have the investment of the federal government in ensuring that no matter where you live in America, your right to vote is real.
Do you realistically think that the HEROES Act will pass in the Senate? That's a question from one of our attendees, Jocelyn Gerber Hewitt.
I think it will pass in some form. Part of the nature of legislation, the nature of government, is that you never get everything you ask for, but the goal is to get what you need. We know that there is bipartisan support for vote by mail. There's bipartisan support for investment in the states to make sure that these elections can be carried out. The Secretary of State of Kentucky, a Republican, who is a protege of Mitch McConnell, he recently revised his remarks and apologized for casting doubt on the legitimacy of vote by mail, because he recognizes that absentee ballots in the state of Kentucky are going to be necessary to guarantee access to the right to vote. We know that secretaries of state across the country, Democrat and Republican, have been lobbying quietly and sometimes publicly for the investment they need. And I think we know that this is an election year. By the time it gets to the Senate, it may not move with the alacrity we would like, but I do believe that the nature of politicians is we want to be elected, and those elections can't happen if the machinery of democracy is broken. And so while the HEROES Act may not pass intact, I think that there are important and critical pieces that will move forward: investment in our states, investment in our elections, investment in our census. And if we can get those things done, as well as continuing to support our frontline essential workers, that would be a HEROES Act that we could stand behind.
You have a book that's about to come out in the middle of a pandemic. How has the pandemic, impacted the book overall? Have you had to rework any sections? I mean, we haven't been able to see the book. It's not out yet, so I can't ask you very specific questions, but talk about how the pandemic has impacted the book.
Well, the book it's called Our Time Is Now. And the frame of the book is, one, to explain what voter suppression looks like in the 21st century by understanding how we got here. And so I take great pains to explain voter suppression in a way that's engaging, that gets you from page 1 at least to page 10 without people falling asleep or just, pushing back. But it really tries to give detailed and granular explanation, but it also then lays out what's possible. And I think that's the most important part of the book, that we live in a moment where we have the ability to, for the first time in our nation's history, truly have equal access to the vote. We've never truly had it. We've made incremental and then sometimes monumental steps, but for every step forward, we can point to stumbles and steps backwards. But in addition, I talk about how we should think about what our politics should look like. I have a section where we talk about why our domestic conversation about democracy has international effect, and particularly how we position ourselves either as a joiner with the populist authoritarians who are enjoying a renaissance now, or how we can actually reshape the liberal order and reassert the notion that democracy must be made real. But I did have to write an afterword where I talk about the role of the pandemic in shaping how we think about who we are. We know that there's been a 40-year assault on the nature of public administration, the scoffing at of bureaucrats whose job it is to keep us safe and to keep our country running. And now when we need them most, we are watching so many of them be assailed and not be positioned to deliver what we need. And so I talk about how the COVID pandemic speaks to not only our domestic responsibility to reshape our public health infrastructure so that communities, especially Black and brown communities, aren't dying at disproportionate rates. I mean, we know here in Georgia, the death toll continues to climb, and it is taking more and more African Americans than any other population. But we also have to think about what we need to do nationwide to reshape our commitment to public health and to a public infrastructure and to a global health security system that means that we don't face the same challenge in response when we hit COVID-22 or COVID-25.
Oh, I'm not ready to start thinking about another COVID.
Well, but I do want to say this. Let's remember that the coronavirus, there were 1,600 examples. COVID-19 exists in part because we did not do our job building a global health security system that could work internationally to trap and to contain this disease. Part of it was China's dissemblance and their lack of courage in sharing data. Part of it was America's, I would say, cowardice in confronting what we needed to do. Part of it's been the fracturing of our international order. Taiwan is the nation state that has done the best job of responding to COVID-19, but they have now been denied both membership in the World Health Organization, even as an observer, and they were denied the same by the World Health Assembly. So the nation that has done the best job is not allowed to participate in the World Health Organization's conversations about what should be done. That happened in part because Donald Trump refused to, in fact, had a public temper tantrum where he yanked away the resources that we invest, which means we diminished our political capital at a time where we need everybody to know what's going on and to have what they need. And that is a challenge that President Tsai, the president of Taiwan, can't meet because she doesn't have the support of democratic leadership in the United States. And I mean small d democratic, meaning that we as a democracy have the responsibility to lift up other democracies doing the right thing, and we should not be kowtowing and bending to autocrats who do not want information to be shared.
In the last couple of minutes you have, of course, gone on record saying that if Joe Biden would like to select you as vice president, you would say yes. My question, since you've already gone on record answering that one, is if you're not selected, would you run for higher office in Georgia again?
Yes.
Any ideas on which one?
Yeah, we'll see what jobs are open.
Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for joining the Atlanta Press Club today. There will be a close from Christy Wooten, who will tell us how we can access this video after the fact, after it gets post-produced. And I thank everyone for participating today, hopefully from the comfort of your living rooms, like Stacey and I. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ricky, and thank you, Christy.
Thank you to Ricky Bevington for being our moderator today. And thank you so much, Stacey Abrams, for being here at such a unusual time and also such a timely moment as we are in the process of voting in the primaries and looking forward to the rest of the events in 2020. Again, Atlanta Press Club would like to thank everyone who attended today. This was actually our very first digital Newsmaker in the history of the club. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I know everyone is living their lives on Zoom nowadays, but we hope that you will visit our website and look for some of the upcoming Newsmaker events that we have coming up, one at the Carter Center, with the Carter Center, not in person, this Thursday, May 21st. And we also have U.S. Attorney BJ Pack on June 9th. Thank you again, everyone. And go to our website. We will have these videos probably within 72 hours available at a link on our site to review. Thank you again.